We would be honored if you would join us.
That then is a clip from the film American Gangster, dating back to 2007. It's directed by Ridley Scott, the screenplay's by Steven Zaillian, and it's based on an article called The Return of Superfly, which was written by Mark Jacobson, getting into that in a second. The cast for American Gangster: Russell Crowe, Denzel Washington, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Cuba Gooding Jr., Josh Brolin, Ted Levine, RZA, Armando Sante, John Hortis, and John Hawkes as well. But American Gangster, as much as it turned into, spoiler for the end of the story, a successful movie, it was at one point going to be a notorious film for costing tens of millions of dollars for Universal Pictures without actually ever being made. So let's go back to the start. It's in the year 2000 that producer Brian Grazer was among many who read an article in New York Magazine about the rise and fall of 1970s gangster Frank Lucas. Now, he was taken with that article, but someone who'd beaten him to it was Steven Zaillian. Now, Steven Zaillian had been put onto the article by a writer by the name of Nicholas Pileggi. Now, Pileggi is a name familiar to those who've listened to all of these podcasts as the writer of Goodfellas and also of Casino. And he recommended I think he and Jacobson were friends. He recommended to Zaillian that he read the article, and Zaillian looked at it and started putting together the guts of a screenplay based on it. And it was when Brian Grazer came along that he bought the rights to the article with the view of turning it into a feature film, and also bought up Zaillian's adaptation of said article. So this was all happening by 2001. Now, in 2002, I've interviewed Steven Zaillian once, really interesting guy, and he talked about how he's very much a one script a year kind of person. He doesn't have multiple things on the go. And so it was in 2002 that the script was in a position to be sent to people to have a look at. And one of the people that Zaillian was interested in the opinion of was Ridley Scott. And so the screenplay went to Ridley Scott. I mean, this was in a year or so in the aftermath of Gladiator. And I think the year before Gladiator had taken home Best Picture. The screenplay was about 170 pages long, and Scott was interested in it. But the thinking was, well, that might be 2 movies. But also Ridley Scott was busy. Gladiator had reignited his commercial career. And as such, things that he was trying to get off the ground were getting off the ground. So he opted to go off and make the film Kingdom of Heaven instead. I should come to that on the podcast, not least because the difference between the extended and the regular cut of Kingdom of Heaven is quite interesting. Anyway, we move forward. So Ridley Scott couldn't do it. But then we head into 2003, and Brian Grazer's still co-head of Imagine Entertainment. Imagine had a deal with Universal Pictures, and towards the end of 2003, according to a report in Variety, it looked like Grazer had settled on his director for American Gangster. That director, Brian De Palma. Now, De Palma, I mean, thinking about it, was quite a logical choice, really. I mean, he had 4 crime films, The Untouchables, his remake of Scarface. But for whatever reason, the De Palma deal never came together. And in early 2004, we had a different director in mind. That man? Antoine Fuqua, who directed Training Day, had just done Tears of the Sun with Bruce Willis, which apparently not a very happy set at all. But in March 2004, with the film under the working title True Blue, with no E at the end of either word, I mean, crikey, Fuqua was set to direct, and having had a good time making Training Day together, which led to Denzel Washington getting his 2nd Academy Award, Denzel Washington was now interested in True Blue without any ease. And so the idea then, with Washington starring, Fuqua directing, they could go into production in the summer of 2004. Delayed at one point then till the autumn, but this was going to be a Universal picture and a big gangster movie. And what's more, a big gangster movie, as Fuqua would point out, that was headlined and directed by black talent as well. This shouldn't have been groundbreaking, but, I mean, it was at that particular point in history. The fact that Universal was going to be stumping up somewhere in the region of $80-90 million as well, and really giving it full heft. I mean, it was really quite something. But the money was giving the studio problems, and Universal wasn't having a massive run of success at this point. And so there was some to and fro, really, between the studio and Antoine Fuqua over things that would save money and things that Fuqua felt were important for the film. Now, the story of True Blue stroke American Gangster is a New York story as well at heart, but lots of productions have done this. There was a discussion about moving the shoot to a Canadian city, Toronto, for instance, to double up as New York. Now, this would have saved a few quid on the budget, but Fuqua was really resistant to that. I mean, because it was such a New York tale, he didn't really want to fake that. And so there was a bit of to and fro there, but Fuqua won that particular battle, but he would go on to lose the overall war because with the film now in New York, the budget was going up again. And as the money went up, Universal's feet got even colder. And in October 2004, the plug was pulled. Now, this wasn't like pulled months ahead of shooting. This was weeks ahead of shooting. It had a cast. Benicio del Toro had come on board at this point. Washington was on board. Fuqua was on board. Locations were being scouted. Crew were being hired. But Universal didn't like the money, didn't like how much it was going to cost. And so it decided at that point, after a very big meeting that apparently didn't go well, it was going to cut its losses. But what losses they were, because two of the cast, Denzel Washington and Benicio del Toro, were on pay or play deals. Now, what this means is you're going to get your money no matter what, whether they have to do it or not, they're going to get paid. And so Washington had negotiated a fee, or his reps had, of $20 million. Del Toro was a good few million as well. And Universal's cost for the film not happening with not a frame of footage was going to be $30 million. That's even more than something like Kevin Smith's abandoned Superman, Tim Burton's abandoned Superman Lives project that Kevin Smith wrote. I mean, it's that level of high cash, really, and the kind that Hollywood studios just don't like splashing around. As the Daily News in America said, American Gangster seemed destined to go down as one of the most expensive non-starters in Hollywood history. As Brian Grazer would reflect in hindsight, he just said it was devastating. He said we cast the movie, we'd hired every department head, we had costumes, locations, props, we were ready to go. Locations had been booked in New York, but Universal just said no. And so an Entertainment Weekly piece in the aftermath of this seismic decision saw the studio seemingly blaming Antoine Fuqua for it going wrong. And so Fuqua had just been directing King Arthur for Disney. Now, as part and parcel of that, Fuqua had to hit a PG-13 rating, and Disney had pushed him into decisions which, by the looks of it, he wasn't that keen on. And as Entertainment Weekly reported, Fuqua jumped from that into Gangster, a politically and racially charged epic, bent on proving himself an auteur. Those were the publication's words. And so, I mean, Fuqua just wasn't going to back down on the things that he felt were important. But again, the Entertainment Weekly piece said, with no set shooting script, Fuqua himself was rewriting the script throughout pre-production, no locked-in shot list, no final locations, and no supporting actors signed. One studio executive was quoted as saying, "It's like writing a blank check." So 4 weeks ahead of shooting, Fuqua was gone. But there was a brief attempt to save the film at that point, that Peter Berg, who directed the brilliant Friday Night Lights, was brought in, and a conversation took place about him taking over directing the film. Denzel Washington, well, a conversation was had with him, and he approved the appointment of Peter Berg. But in the end, it was just too late for Universal, that it looked at appointing Berg, but the cost wasn't coming down, the risk was too high, and it shut it all down. Berg went, the film went, Universal's bank balance went as well. And so, as MovieWeb confirmed at around the time, it just said Universal drew the line because of fears that the gritty period drama was on course to cost more than $100 million. The studio also knew this was going to be an R-rated film, and your chances of getting $100 million back at the box office for an R-rated gritty drama were not on the high side, particularly at that point that this was Universal and it was making things like Battleship, and it couldn't really buy itself a hit, certainly not a profitable one at that point. Still, Brian Grazer took another look, even after Peter Berg moved away from the film, at retooling the project to see if it could just be made for less. And so he worked with the vice chairman of Universal at the time, a man called Scott Stuber. And the idea at that stage was, let's take a look at it, let's make it cheaper, let's see if we can do it for $50 million. And so it was at this point that Terry George came in. Terry George had written and directed a modestly costed film called Hotel Rwanda to great acclaim as well. And in March 2005, with Grazer keen to keep the film going, George was announced as the writer-director of the film. Now, at that stage, it was then expected that Don Cheadle would be offered the lead role in place of Denzel Washington. In fact, Joaquin Phoenix was also linked with co-starring opposite Don Cheadle, a cheaper cast, even though Washington still got his 20 million, and Will Smith was reportedly approached as well. And Terry George did work on a script, and he did strip it right the way down. Steven Zaillian no longer involved, and so they retooled and retooled and retooled, and it would have come in at a much cheaper price, but it would have taken away some key overseen sequences that are part of the story. I'm not going deep into the story in case you've not seen the film, but not all of it takes place in New York. There are one or two moments that in the script had to take place outside of, and things like that were kind of stripped back. And it got to the point where Brian Grazer was feeling, actually, this might just be a little bit retooled too much. We might not have got this right. And so that seemed to be that. But, I mean, the fact that we're talking about it and the fact that the films exist, well, it got made. And as Steven Zaillian would reflect, I think it was to the Los Angeles Times on the eve of release, he just said it was a long, crooked road that ended up back where we started. And Zaillian said something like this never happens. I mean, never happens. And, you know, he's pretty much right. Because, I mean, I've been doing this podcast for over 400 episodes, and I've talked about films that have shut down. We've talked about things like BioShock, for instance. That shut down. World War Z 2, that shut down. Those films have not come back. The vast majority of films that get shut down do not come back. But this one did. And Zaillian was one of those who was reportedly key to it resurrecting, because he'd worked with Ridley Scott by this point on Hannibal. He'd done some work on the film Black Hawk Down as well. And as Ridley Scott would tell Empire, it was actually Steven Zaillian who first told him to read the script. And Scott said, I first read it about 3.5 years ago and I loved it. Great characters, great time period, great feeling. And he just said, I didn't know whether I was getting offered it or not back then, but I couldn't do it anyway because I was about to start Kingdom of Heaven. And then he went on to do A Good Year with Russell Crowe. And he said at that point to Empire that I heard it had problems then and wasn't happening. And I said to Russell, have you read it? What do you think? Let's make it work. And so, I mean, Scott remembered the script. Scott took a look at it and was interested. Russell Crowe took a look at it and was interested. And Russell Crowe was red hot at that point. He'd won his Oscar for Gladiator. He'd done The Insider just the year before. Amazing performance. Really, really loved that film as well. And so Scott was now interested, Russell Crowe was interested, and they got in touch with Brian Grazer, and it was working on the not massively liked film A Good Year that didn't get great reviews for Scott and Russell Crowe, that in a weird way unlocked American Gangster. There was also a film that didn't get made called Invisible World for Paramount Pictures, which Ridley Scott was going to direct. Angelina Jolie was said to headline that. But Angelina Jolie was then pregnant and couldn't make the film. And so that production was cancelled and Ridley Scott had a gap in his schedule. And if there's one man out there who loves filling gaps in his schedule, you have to say it's pretty much Ridley Scott. And so you've got an assortment of conversations and confluences of circumstance coming together, really, that led to, in the end, Ridley Scott signing up to direct American Gangster at the end of 2005. It was called American Gangster, and I can by this stage, and I can confirm that the word gangster had its E in place, as rightly so. This was a project resurrection and a half, that Russell Crowe would come along with Ridley Scott. They were in a run of films, actually, at that point. I think this would be the third of a run of 5 films that they were doing together fairly quickly in a line. And so it was now, I mean, there was the Denzel Washington question. Washington didn't have to come back. He got his $20 million. They hadn't made the film, but he agreed to come back and didn't take money. at the point that he re-signed. I don't know if they gave him a couple of quid down the line, but he'd been paid. He wasn't going to be suffering. Let's put it that way, at least financially so. And also, he'd worked with Russell Crowe on Brett Leonard's film Virtuosity. They've both done this, it went straight to video here in the UK. This 90s genre movie together. So they sort of knew each other. Although it would be fair to say both of their careers had escalated since, and Oscars had been awarded to the pair. Although Washington already had an Oscar by that point, I should point out. With Scott on board, there was back and forth with the script a little bit, and there was the question of Steven Zaillian, because Zaillian, when Terry George came in, had been off the project, and Grazer would admit that he wanted to rehire Steven Zaillian, but he said he felt guilty about the radical overhaul of his script that took place when he was off the film. And so, as Grazer would say, you start a movie, it doesn't get made. You start it again and cut out all the guy's great scenes. And he just said in the end, I called and apologised to Steve, and I said, I'm sorry this happened. Zaillian was won over, and he came back to work on the script. And as Scott would say, this was in an interview with Empire. He just said, Scott was happy for everyone to have their input on the film, but at the end of the day, it was down to him. And he said it gets to point of craziness when there are too many cooks in the kitchen. Someone has got to be the chef, and someone has to say, no, wash your hands, you don't chop onions that way, and I'm the chef. Can you imagine on the set of House of Gucci if he just said that in a faux Italian accent? No, wash your hands, you don't chop onions that way. That's how I want to direct a film. Who am I to argue with Ridley Scott? By May then of 2006, the film was now approved for production again at Universal, with the proviso that if it cost more than $100 million to make, both Brian Grazer and Ridley Scott would have to pay anything over that the film went. As it turned out, they would each have to fork out around $1.5 million a piece, because it did just slightly go over. That $100 million budget, though, interestingly, was just the kind of alarm that had spooked the studio when Antoine Fuqua was going to direct. In fact, when Fuqua was directing, it was coming in at around 90 million, and they shot it down. Now it's 100 million, and they're pressing ahead with it. Universal did feel a little more insulated by having two movie stars at the top of the bill, Russell Crowe and Denzel Washington. But as Grazer would say, Universal's decision to make this movie defies any kind of logic of how the studio system works today. And so even though the budget went over a little bit, the fact was Universal wrote the kind of check that had sent it running away from the film in the first place. Scott was casting the movie then as we went from spring into summer. We didn't get the announcement that Josh Brolin was involved, for instance, until after shooting had begun. But shooting did begin finally in July 2006 in primarily New York. And it was an intensive location shoot. This was not a film that was hiding on sound stages or being shot outside of the glare of the public. They went to locations, and lots of them. In fact, it was said that at the time it was being made, American Gangster broke a record for the most locations for a single film. Over the course of the 4-month shoot for the movie, they used 180 different locations, more than that. Over 350 individual scenes needed shooting as well. And Ridley Scott would reflect that this was one of his biggest ever productions. And this is Ridley Scott. There were still ways that they could save a bit of money. There's one sequence that takes place in the film at Madison Square Gardens in New York, a recreation of the famous fight between Muhammad Ali and Smoking Joe Frazier. And they approached Madison Square Garden. It's like, can we go and shoot it there? And the venue wanted $350,000 for just one evening. And so, no, they're not paying that. And instead, they went to a nearby hockey stadium instead, and they dressed it as Madison Square Garden and got a lot of change that they could all spend on pizzas and chips. Furthermore, when they came to shooting the sequence of the boxing match there, they did bring in hundreds of extras. I think around 600 extras in all were bussed in for that. But the crowd that you see in the film is a lot bigger, but also it's not a digital crowd. If you go back to, I think I must have mentioned this at least once, there's a John Goodman headline movie, The Babe, which again went straight to video here in the UK. It's the biopic of Babe Ruth, and there are several baseball sequences where they are using, I think it's the first film that was using computers to digitally replicate a crowd. And so the technology was in place for Scott to do that, but he didn't. And instead, what they brought in was, go on, have a guess, inflatable dummies. They brought in over 1,000 inflatable dummies, put them in costumes. That is the majority of the spectators watching the fight. Freeze frame it. Go and have a look. They're all in there. Also on the set, as well as inflatable dummies, was a real-life gangster. I shouldn't have put that in the same sentence, should I? I'm going to be in trouble. The real Frank Lucas was a daily presence on the set, and Scott would check in with him on certain things. And also, Richie Roberts, who's been portrayed by Russell Crowe, visited the production too. The pair had worked with Washington and Crowe as and when required. This wasn't a case where a real-life story's actual real-life subjects were being kept at arm's length through the production. Far from it, as it turned out. Still, the fact that there were real-life subjects and a real-life gangster story and the real-life people involved were so close was causing a little bit of a pushback during the shoot of the film, that there were questions being asked in the press about whether American Gangster would be glamorising Lucas, given that he was an alleged drugs lord and murderer. Ridley Scott typically downplayed this. I mean, he said he was focused on delivering a film that really took the gloss away from late 60s and early 70s New York. He didn't want this to be a gleaming depiction of the city. He wanted to get into the down and dirty corners of it, hence the sheer amount of locations that he put on screen. The production also went over to Thailand, but it wrapped up in November 2006. 4 months, really, and a very, very hefty production at that. And Scott, during the post-production of the movie, would talk about how there's absolutely no CG in the film at all, that this was a digital effects-free zone, hence you get inflatable things going on and stuff like that. And so he was he was really talking up that element of the movie. Also, typically, he was gearing up for his next couple of films as well. I mean, during interviews for American Gangster, he was basically saying he knows what his next two movies are. One would be 2008's Body of Lies. That would reunite him again with Russell Crowe, this time opposite Leonardo DiCaprio. And then he was talking about how he wanted to do a very different take on the Robin Hood story that came out in 2010 and wouldn't be one of his most successful endeavours. Perhaps we'll come to that in a future episode of the podcast. Universal, though, I mean, it seemed quite positive about what it had with American Gangster, and it was going to release it in October of 2007. Certainly that was the point it was going to premiere the film, and then a wide release at the start of November 2007. So it was primed really in an Oscar slot, and also it was primed so that it could make a fair amount of money on its travels as well. The response to the movie when it went before critics was positive as well. I mean, the whole classic gangster genre was brought up by more than one reviewer. Lots of people were very, very positive about the film. An intelligent gangster movie that was coming out as well. The performances were really quite strong. They were being brought out for praise as well. And people were punching a few holes in it and just saying that there's just something a little bit missing in there, that the sense of deja vu in terms of like the big Hollywood gangster movie, but still the overall response here was positive, and Universal could launch this $100 million film, and the final price of the film was supposed to be in that region, but $103 million as it turned out, just because of those overages involved. And so it gave it a big, noisy, loud launch, and it went into American cinemas right at the start of November. Looking then at the box office chart, November the 2nd to the 4th, 2007, what sits atop of it with a big screen average as well? American Gangster, this $100 million $103 million risky project, opened with $43.5 million at the US box office alone. That was a sensational result for an R-rated drama. It held off a challenge from a family movie, B-movie from DreamWorks, which had $38 million. The previous week's number one was Saw 4, which was now down to second place. Also around the underseen, really, Steve Carell headline, Dan in Real Life. As Dwayne Johnson in The Game Plan was down in fifth. 30 Days of Night was in sixth. It's a film called Martian Child, which was in at seventh, and I don't remember that at all. I don't think we got it in the UK in the end. We had George Clooney and Michael Clayton, terrific film, that down in eighth. Why Did I Get Married at 9? Gone Baby Gone, Ben Affleck's directorial debut, was down in 10. American Gangster didn't stay at the top of the box office for long. B-Movie jumped above it in its second week, but American Gangster only lost 44 million, crikey, only lost 44% of its business on its second weekend, adding another 24 million, B-Movie 25.5. Interesting competition that weekend as well. Lions for Lambs, Robert Redford and Tom Cruise. Now, that was the movie that was relaunching United Artists with Tom Cruise steering the studio creatively. That's a whole story for another time. I should come to that. Not a bad film, Lions for Lambs, but it didn't do great box office. Fred Claus opened that weekend as well with 18 million, but still American Gangster had carved out a decent amount of money, crossed 100 million on its third weekend as Robert Zemeckis' Beowulf movie opened in first place. And then, I mean, if we look, 4 weeks after release, only then did it start to tumble. It was down to 8th at the box office, and lots of big seasonal releases came out. All the Thanksgiving, you had Enchanted, you had This Christmas, you had Hitman, you had August Rush. By the time American Gangster left American cinemas, $130 million was in the bank. But then outside of the US as well, I mean, this film travelled $139 million. And so Universal could sit happily with a take of $269 million. Then it became a big hit on DVD and Blu-ray as well. And then it found itself in the awards conversation, perhaps not as much as originally expected, though, because there had been early talk of American Gangster being a real Best Picture Oscar contender, but the Academy Awards gave it 2 nominations in the end. One was for Ruby Dee for Best Supporting Actress, and the other was for Arthur Max and Beth A. Rubino's art direction. It took home neither of those gongs. The BAFTAs here in the UK, it was nominated for Best Film, Script, Cinematography, Music and Editing. It took home none of those gongs. And so it's kind of shut out in the end from the big awards. The Oscars that year, I'm glad you asked, they were being won by No Country for Old Men, and there was prize for There Will Be Blood as well. Nothing in there for American Gangster, though, but there was a nice hefty profit in the end for the studio. There was also a little bit of afters with the film that, I should note as well, just a few days ahead of the movie's release, this was a movie that leaked online because they were pushing it for an Oscar run. And this was the point where Oscar films were sent out on DVD to Academy Awards voters. One of those DVDs was leaked online. And so, I mean, it was doing the rounds on the internet before you could see the film in the cinema. That potentially could have hit the film. And it's happened a few times over the years. X-Men Origins Wolverine was the first big blockbuster that happened to. But I think one of the Expendables films it happened to. Scott, for the DVD release, I should note, did put together one of his, he does it often, extended versions, adding an extra 18 minutes and a changed ending. But going back to those afters, both Frank Lucas and Richard Roberts would be critical of what they saw of the film in the end. As much as they were relatively supportive of it, they did cite the fact that there were lots of inaccuracies in it and did push back about it. And then many years later, Antoine Fuqua, who's gone on to direct Denzel Washington in The Magnificent Seven and the Equalizer movies as well, he would reflect just a couple of years ago to Collider how that film fell apart because of financing. And he said that at the time, Universal couldn't come to an understanding of the budget or cast. He said, I cast Benicio del Toro, who of course didn't feature in the final film, alongside Denzel, which is what I wanted it to be, Benicio and Denzel. And he said at the time, Universal had other clients, and when that fell apart, that broke my heart. That movie still breaks my heart. I prepped that whole movie and prepared to shoot in a couple of weeks. And, well, from the outside looking in, for about a year at least, really, American Gangster was, a $30 million non-film. It didn't get made in the way that it was originally intended. It went through a few directors. Can you imagine the Brian De Palma version? The version that came out at the end, though, few could really quarrel with. Universal couldn't in the end. Denzel Washington did well out of it. Russell Crowe did well out of it. And Ridley Scott, well, he could move straight on to his next 2 or 3 films.